Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I am Dr. Hind Hassan, Assistant Lecturer of Human Anatomy and Embryology. Inshallah, we will discuss the third topic in the practical topics of neuroanatomy, which will be the external features of the cerebral hemispheres. Let's remember that the cerebral hemispheres developed from the telencephalon. Telencephalon was developed from the prosencephalon, which is one of the primary brain vesicles. Telencephalon will give the cerebral hemispheres, and the cavity of the cerebral hemisphere will be the lateral ventricle, and this lateral ventricle will communicate with the cavity of the diencephalon, which is the third ventricle, through foramen called interventricular foramen of Monro. What about the external features of the cerebral hemispheres? We will start by surfaces and borders. When you look here at this view, you see the cerebral hemispheres from the inferior surface. But when we take a sagittal section in the brain, we will see two other surfaces. We will see this one and that one. This will be the lateral surface, and this will be the medial surface of the cerebral hemisphere. What is an important landmark for the medial surface? These fibers. This is called the corpus callosum. What is corpus callosum? We have different types of nerve fibers inside the cerebral hemispheres. The first type is called commissural fibers. The commissural fibers connect the same cortical areas in the two cerebral hemispheres. So these fibers cross the midline. So when you cut the brain in the midline, in the sagittal section, you will find, while you are looking on the medial surface, you will find the corpus callosum. This is the major and the largest commissural fibers. So this will be the lateral surface. This is the medial surface known by corpus callosum, and this corpus callosum is formed of four parts. From anteriorly backwards, we have rostrum, then geno, then the body of corpus callosum, and the last part will be the splenium. While this surface will be the inferior surface, and the inferior surface will be divided into anterior part called orbital part, and posterior part called tentorial part. Look at this model. We take a sagittal section in the brain, dividing it into two equal right and left halves. This is the left half of the brain. We are looking to the cerebral hemisphere. Cerebral hemisphere has three borders separating three surfaces. Let's talk about the borders firstly. This is the superolateral border. This is called the superior border. We have other two borders. This is the medial border, while this is the lateral one. These three borders divide three surfaces. So in between the medial and the lateral border, we have the inferior surface. And this inferior surface is divided into anterior part called orbital part and posterior part called tentorial part. While between the superior and the medial borders, we have the medial surface. And the medial surface shows this bundle. This is called the corpus callosum. Corpus callosum, commissural fiber, connects the two cerebral hemispheres. It is composed of different parts. This is the rostrum, this is the geno, then body, and the posterior part is called the splenium. And the last surface lies between the superior and the lateral border. This is called the lateral surface. When we are looking at the surface of the cerebral hemisphere, we will find grooves and elevations in between these grooves. These grooves are called sulci, and in between we have areas called gyri. So let's revise what we see on the specimen. About borders, we have this one, which is called the superior border. We have the medial border, and also that one which is the lateral border. So these three borders divide the cerebral hemisphere into three surfaces. This will be the lateral surface between the superior and the lateral border. This will be the inferior surface between medial and lateral borders. And this is the medial surface between both superior and medial borders. What about major sulci present on each surface? I will start by the major sulci on the medial surface. Sulci means depressions, like that. If you remember the cerebellum, cerebellar surface shows depressions but called fissures. And the elevations in between fissures in the cerebellum were named folia. So in the cerebellum, we have fissures and folia. But in the cerebral hemisphere, we have, instead of fissures, sulci, and instead of folia, areas elevated called gyri. We will start by the major sulci. The major sulci on the medial surface will be this, which is the calcarine sulcus. And from the middle of the calcarine sulcus till cutting the superior border, we will have the parieto-occipital sulcus. What about major sulci on the lateral surface? We will have a central sulcus, lateral sulcus, and should know that the lateral sulcus shows three rami. This is the anterior ramus, this is the ascending ramus, while the continuity of the lateral sulcus will be the posterior ramus. Also on the lateral surface, you will find extensions from the two major sulci present on the medial surface, which were calcarine and parieto-occipital. So what about lobes and balls of the cerebral hemisphere? By the major four sulci, we will divide the cerebral hemisphere into four lobes. The first lobe is called the frontal lobe. It is situated above the lateral sulcus and anterior to the central sulcus. The next lobe will be the parietal lobe. It is located between the central and the parieto-occipital sulci and also above the lateral sulcus. Also, we have a temporal lobe lying below the lateral sulcus. And the last lobe will be the occipital lobe. It lies behind the parieto-occipital sulcus. So we have four lobes: frontal, parietal, occipital, and temporal. What about poles? We have three poles. We have the frontal pole, which is the anterior end of the frontal lobe, temporal pole, which is the anterior end of the temporal lobe, and finally the occipital pole, which is the posterior end of the occipital lobe. So about each cerebral hemisphere, we have three borders, three surfaces, three poles, but four lobes and four major sulci. What about all important sulci present on lateral surface? Firstly, we know about the central sulcus. What else? We will find another sulcus anteriorly and parallel to the central sulcus called the precentral sulcus. Also, we have another one behind and parallel to the central sulcus called postcentral sulcus. In the frontal lobe, we have superior and inferior frontal sulci. In the temporal lobe, we have superior and inferior temporal sulci. Also, in the parietal lobe, we will have a curved sulcus. This sulcus is called intraparietal sulcus. And forget the extensions of the two major sulci present on the medial surface and appear on the lateral surface. This is the parieto-occipital, and this blackish one is the calcarine. We also have a curved sulcus surrounds the terminal end of the calcarine sulcus called the leonate sulcus, and don't forget the lateral sulcus and its three rami: anterior, ascending, and posterior ramus. So to remember sulci on the lateral surface, you can know that you have the central, and in front of it precentral, and behind it postcentral. So these are three. Also remember the three rami of the lateral sulcus. So these are three and those are three. Remember that you have superior and inferior frontal and superior and inferior temporal. Also you have another two curved sulci, which are the leonate sulcus and the intraparietal sulcus, and the last two will be the extensions from the medial surface, calcarine and parieto-occipital. So you have three central, three rami of the lateral, two frontal, two temporal, two curved, and two extensions from the medial surface. These are the three rami. What about areas in between sulci, which are named gyri on the lateral surface? Between central and precentral sulcus, we have gyrus called precentral gyrus. So between central and post-central sulcus, we have another gyrus named post-central gyrus. Because we have two frontal sulci, so the frontal lobe will be formed of three frontal gyri. So we have superior frontal gyrus, middle frontal gyrus, and the inferior one, which is the inferior frontal gyrus. But if you look at the inferior frontal gyrus, you will find it divided into three areas by the rami of the lateral sulcus. So the inferior frontal gyrus will show three areas. The first one, the first O, will be opercular gyrus. This will be the triangular gyrus, and this is another O for the orbital gyrus. What about the temporal lobe? It will show three temporal gyri: superior temporal, middle temporal, and the inferior temporal gyrus. What about the parietal lobe? It is divided by this curved sulcus, which is the intraparietal sulcus, into superior and inferior parietal lobule or gyri. We will find also that the inferior frontal lobule is divided into two gyri, like the inferior frontal gyrus divided into three regions or three gyri. These two gyri are, this one is the supramarginal gyrus that surrounds the terminal end of the posterior ramus of the lateral sulcus, and that one will be the angular gyrus, which surrounds the posterior end of the superior temporal sulcus. So we have precentral and postcentral, three frontal, three temporal gyri, and the superior and inferior parietal lobules. And remember that we have two of the inferior gyri divided into divisions, like the inferior frontal gyrus divided into opercular, orbital, and triangular gyri, and the inferior parietal lobule divided into angular and supramarginal gyri. Why we should know this sulci and gyri, we will know later. What about the sulci on the medial surface? This is the medial surface because this is the corpus callosum and its four parts as rostrum, genu, body, and splenium. Above corpus callosum, immediately you will find the callosal sulcus. Parallel to it, you will find the cingulate sulcus. And don't forget the two major sulci on the medial surface. This will be the calcarine, which starts from the occipital bole, while that one will be the parieto-occipital sulcus. What about the important gyri? The first gyrus to be found on the medial surface is the gyrus present between the callosal and the cingulate sulci, which is named the cingulate gyrus. And what about other gyri on the medial surface? We can arrange them from below the calcarine sulcus, and you can ascend and rotate in the anti-clockwise direction. So I can arrange them as lingual gyrus. Above calcarine sulcus, we will find the cuneus. In front of cuneus, there is precuneus. And in front of precuneus, there is the paracentral lobule. While in front of the paracentral lobule, we will find the medial frontal gyrus. What about the inferior surface? This is the orbital part, while this is the tentorial part. What about major sulci or sulci on the inferior surface? On the orbital part, we will find the olfactory sulcus, and lateral to it, the H-shaped orbital sulcus. On the tentorial surface, we will find the collateral sulcus, continue anteriorly as rhinal sulcus, and lateral to it, we will find the occipito-temporal sulcus. What about the gyri on the inferior surface? Medial to the olfactory sulcus, we have gyrus rectus, and the H-shaped olfactory sulcus divides the four olfactory gyri from each others. We have anterior, posterior, medial, and lateral orbital gyri. On the tentorial part of the inferior surface, we have this gyrus. This gyrus is medial to the collateral sulcus. It is called parahippocampal gyrus. And you should know that inside the parahippocampal gyrus, if you enter deeply, you will find area called the hippocampus, which is a part of the limbic system. This is a system concerned with emotional behavior, olfaction, and memory. Medial to the rhinal sulcus and anterior to the parahippocampal gyrus, you will find area called uncus. In between the collateral sulcus, this one, and the occipitotemporal sulcus, you will find this gyrus. It is called the occipitotemporal or the fusiform gyrus. While lateral to the occipitotemporal sulcus, you will find the inferior temporal gyrus. The importance of knowing this sulci and gyri is to know the site of the important cortical areas. What about cortical areas present on the lateral surface? We will find that the frontal lobe contains the motor areas, while the other three lobes, parietal, occipital, and temporal, contains the sensory areas. And you should know also that any sense should be presented by two sensory areas. The first one is called the primary sensory area, and this area should be perceive this sense, while the next area will be the sensory association area, and this area is responsible for recognition of the sense. So we will start by the motor areas present in the frontal lobe. In the precentral sulcus, we will find the primary motor area or area 4. In front of it, there is the premotor area or area 6. In front of it, you will find area 8 or the motor eye field area. This area is responsible for the conjugate movement of two eyes. And along the frontal pole, you will find the personality center, area number 9, 10, 11, and also 12 on the medial surface. And the last area to be found on the frontal lobe will be the motor speech area, Broca's area. It is represented in the opercular gyrus and triangular gyrus. It is number 44 and 45. So the frontal lobe contains the motor areas 4, 6, 8, then 9, 10, and 11, and finally Broca's area, area 44 and 45. About sensory areas in the other lobes, we will start by the temporal lobe, and we will find in the floor or the superior surface of the superior temporal gyrus, we will find the primary auditory area, area 44, 41, and 42. Behind it, in the posterior part of the superior temporal gyrus, we will find the auditory association area. It is called vernix area or area 22. About other sensory areas, we will find the general sensory area, area 3, 1, and 2 in the postcentral gyrus, and also the somatosensory association areas in the superior parietal lobule, area 5 and 7, and in the supramarginal gyrus, area 40, and this area is for stereognosis or recognition of a given object by the sense of touch with closed eyes. What about the primary test area, area 43? It is present in the lower part of the postcentral gyrus together with the vestibular area also in the same side. And finally, what about the sensory speech areas? Sensory speech areas are those three areas. We have area 39 present in the angular gyrus to recognize the written language. Area 40 for stereognosis and also to recognize the body image, to know your right from your left, and also vernix area to understand the spoken language, area 22. These are the important cortical areas present on the lateral surface. What about cortical areas present on the medial surface? You will find the primary visual area, area 17, present in the lips of the calcarine sulcus, and around it in the lingual gyrus and the cuneus, you will find the visual association areas, areas 18 and 19. What about the inferior surface cortical areas? We will find in the uncus, medial to the rhinal sulcus, we will find the primary olfactory area or area 43, and behind it in the anterior part of the parahippocampal gyrus, we will find the entorhinal area, area 28. It is the olfactory association area. So we should have a specimen to see these surfaces and to know sulci and gyri. Let's see the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. This will be the orbital part of the inferior surface, and that's the tentorial part. So OR is for the orbital part and TN for the tentorial part. What about TB? It is the anterior end of the temporal lobe, which is the temporal bole. When we look at the sulci, we will find OS, it is for the olfactory sulcus, and medial to it, look at the opposite view, this will be the olfactory sulcus, and so medial to it, this is the olfactory gyrus or gyrus rectus. And this H-shaped sulcus, look at this, will be the orbital sulcus dividing the 4 orbital gyri. What about sulci present on the inferior surface or the tentorial part of the inferior surface? We will find the collateral sulcus. Medial to it, this is the parahippocampal gyrus. This will be the uncus. This is the occipito-temporal sulcus. And so this will be the fusiform or the occipito-temporal gyrus. This surface is the lateral surface of the cerebral hemisphere. So this will be the central sulcus. This will be the precentral sulcus, and in between you will find the precentral gyrus. This is the post-central sulcus, and area in between it and the central sulcus will be the post-central gyrus. Also, this is the frontal lobe. So this is the superior and the inferior frontal sulci separating the 3 frontal gyri from each other. Another view, this is for the inferior surface of the cerebral hemisphere. So this will be the orbital part, this will be the tentorial part. And also TB is for the temporal bole. What is this? This will be the interpeduncular fossa, as we said before. U is for the uncus, while CB is for the cerebral peduncle. PO is basis pontis, while MO is for the medulla. This is the cerebellar hemisphere, and this will be the inferior vermis because it lies deep in the vallecula. This is another view for the inferior surface also. So this will be the orbital part, this will be the tentorial part, this is the temporal bole, this will be the uncus. And if you look to the ventral aspect of the brainstem, especially to the ventral aspect of medulla, you will find the 3 elevations. This is the pyramid, this is the olive, while this is the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Here is the basilar artery running in the basilar groove, and those are the transverse pontine fibers. So this will be the middle cerebellar peduncle connecting bones with the cerebellum. What about this surface? This is the medial surface. How we know the medial surface from the corpus callosum? Look at sulci and gyri. Immediately above corpus callosum, we have the callosal sulcus. So this will be the cingulate sulcus. In between, we have the cingulate gyrus. About other gyri on the medial surface, we will arrange them from below the calcarine sulcus. So this is the parieto-occipital sulcus. About gyri, below the calcarine, we will find lingual gyrus. Above it, cuneus, then precuneus, paracentral lobule, and in front of it, the medial frontal gyrus. In this sagittal section and on the medial surface also, we will find the 3 parts of the brainstem. This is the midbrain, this is pons, and this is the medulla. This cavity is the 4th ventricle, and this is 1 cerebellar hemispheres.